There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone who has laughed at walks back in holding the proof. I've witnessed courtroom verdicts. I've stood at the edge of wildfires when the wind changed direction. I've watched men twice Clara Redhawk's size fold under the weight of a single hard season. But nothing, not one thing in 31 years of keeping records in this county, prepared me for the morning she unrolled that map across the commissioner's table and said, without raising her voice, "Page 4. The aquifer recharge zones. You'll find they match exactly." Nobody laughed that morning. That's the part they don't tell you. They don't tell you about the silence after. They spend years perfecting the mockery, sharpening it at town halls and feed store counters and Sunday parking lots. And then when the thing they mocked turns out to be the only thing standing between their cattle and a dead summer, they go very, very quiet. I'm getting ahead of myself. I do that. My wife says I've been doing it since the day we met, starting stories at the end and working backward like a man trying to find where he dropped something precious. So let me go back to the beginning, to the mud, to the mockery, to the 120 shallow ponds that Clara Redhawk dug by hand across 42 acres of alkaline hardpan that everyone in Crockett County agreed was useless. The first time I met Clara Redhawk, she was standing shin-deep in what looked like a mistake. It was the third week of April, 2 years before the drought that broke us all, and I was driving the county road that cuts behind the Mendoza grazing allotment when I saw her pickup, a '94 Dodge so orange with rust it looked like a geological feature, parked at the lip of what I first took to be a collapsed irrigation channel. Then I saw her in it, standing still, both hands open at her sides, palms facing down, like she was feeling for something in the air that no one else could detect. I pulled over because that's what you do out here. You don't drive past a person standing alone in a mud hole. Partly it's courtesy. Partly it's that the land is unforgiving enough that you want someone to stop for you someday. She didn't look up when I climbed out of my truck. She was maybe 50 yards off the road, and I covered that distance slowly, the way you do when you're not sure whether you're approaching a person in trouble or a person deep in something private. "You all right?" I called. She turned then. Clara Redhawk was, I don't know how to put this without it sounding like I'm describing a landscape feature instead of a person. She had that kind of stillness about her that you sometimes see in people who have spent decades watching things grow slow. Deep-set eyes, dark as mesquite heartwood, cheekbones that caught the morning light. She wore canvas work pants cuffed at the knee, a cotton shirt dark with sweat at the collar, and a straw hat with a raven feather tucked into the band that I later learned she'd been wearing since her grandmother pressed it there 20 years prior. "Fine," she said. She didn't say it like it was the end of a conversation. She said it like the beginning of one. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing at the depression she was standing in. It was maybe 15 feet across, 2 feet deep at the center, walls shaped like they'd been carved deliberately, though with what I couldn't tell. The bottom held maybe 3 inches of murky water. "Pond," she said. I looked at it, then I looked at her. "That's a generous word for it," I said. She tilted her head, and something moved across her face, not offense exactly, more like the mild interest of someone who's heard a variation of that before. "Come back in 6 weeks," she said, and turned back to whatever she'd been measuring in the air. I drove away thinking she was eccentric. I made a note in my logbook. I keep logbooks going on 20 years, moleskin-bound, 1 per season, which my wife says makes me a hoarder, and which I maintain makes me a historian. That there was a woman digging ponds in the alkaline flats behind Mendoza, and that I should follow up. That entry is dated April 19th. I checked it this morning. What I didn't know then, what I had no way of knowing from that road, was that the pond I'd seen was number 7. Clara had started in late February, when the ground was still cold enough that breaking it hurt her wrists. She'd mapped the terrain herself, walked it on foot across 6 days in January, carrying a survey rod and a notebook filled with elevation readings she took by eye and instrument both. Her methodology was a hybrid that the university hydrologist she later consulted called unprecedented. Part traditional Apache water reading practice passed through her grandmother's hands. Part soil science she'd taught herself from textbooks checked out of the Sanderson Library. Part intuition honed by 4 decades of watching how this particular landscape received and rejected water. She'd identified 17 zones of what she called slow clay, subsurface deposits that held moisture longer than the surrounding alkaline crust. Her theory, which she'd worked out in the margins of those textbooks, and in 3 spiral notebooks she kept in a lockbox under her bed, was that a network of small surface ponds positioned directly above these zones would do 2 things. Slow the movement of rainfall and runoff long enough for percolation to occur, and create microenvironments of moisture that could recharge a declining aquifer she'd been tracking through her well's water table since 1998. She'd been watching that water table drop for 24 years. 1 inch per year average, sometimes 2, never recovering in wet years the way it once had. She'd kept records, not logbooks like mine, but a pencil line on the interior wall of her well house, dated each January 1st, going back to the year she'd moved onto the property she'd inherited from her grandmother's estate. 24 lines, each one lower than the last. She hadn't told anyone about the lines, not her neighbor Pete Aldis, who ran cattle on the adjacent section and with whom she had a complicated relationship built on shared fence line and mutual wariness. Not the county extension agent, who came out twice a year and always addressed his pamphlets to whoever owned the land as if she might be a guest on her own property. Not her daughter in El Paso, who called on Sundays and asked when Clara was going to get somewhere with water pressure. She'd told her grandmother, or rather, she'd told the space her grandmother used to occupy. She'd stand at that well house wall in the early morning and say things out loud in a low voice that was half Apache Nday dialect and half English and half something that wasn't language exactly. She'd told me about this later, and she'd said it without any self-consciousness, which I found remarkable. Most people apologize for the things that keep them sane. She didn't apologize for anything. By the time I saw her in April, she was digging the ponds alone. She'd asked Pete Aldis in February if he'd be willing to share labor. She needed help with the earth moving, and she had a small Kubota she couldn't always operate alone because of the shoulder she'd torn 10 years prior and never properly rehabilitated. Pete had listened to her explanation with the particular expression of a man who has already decided something and is waiting politely for the words to stop. Then he'd said, "Clara, that hardpan won't hold a pond. Never has." She'd shown him the soil core samples she'd taken. He'd glanced at them. He'd said, "Where'd you learn hydrology?" And she'd said, "Same place you learned cattle ranching." And he'd looked confused because he'd learned it from his father, and she'd nodded like that answered the question. He didn't help. She approached 2 other neighbors, got the same basic response wrapped in different paper. One of them, I won't use names, but this man has since asked me twice not to write about what he said, told her the ponds were an Apache thing delivered with a tone that was meant to close the subject, as if culture were a synonym for delusion. She came home from that conversation. She told me later, and dug for 4 hours in the dark using a headlamp and a post hole digger until her shoulder locked up completely, and she had to sit in the dirt until it unknotted enough to drive home. That's the part that stays with me, not the insult. Insults are just noise. It's the 4 hours of digging in the dark. It's the way she converted that particular pain into something structural, something she could stand in. The mockery, when it came, was communal and cheerful the way that kind of mockery always is. It started at the Seco Creek Cattlemen's meeting in early May. I was there. I attend as secretary, have for 11 years, and someone brought up the water conversation that always comes up in dry spring years, and Pete Aldis mentioned Clara's ponds in the way that men mention things when they want to laugh without being the one who made the joke. "You seen what Clara Redhawk's doing out on the flats?" Pause. "Digging ponds." Longer pause. "120 of 'em, she says." The laugh was instant and generous. Someone said mud puddles, and that got a second laugh. Someone else said she'd be better off drilling, and a third man said she'd have better luck praying, and this seemed very funny to everyone in the room, and I wrote in my logbook that evening. Red Hawk Mud Pond project discussed at Cattlemen's meeting. General consensus, waste of effort. No one asked how the ponds were doing. That last line I underlined. I didn't know why at the time, now I do. I went back in June. I've been thinking about her since April, the way you think about an image that doesn't quite resolve. I drove the county road and turned down her access track without calling ahead. Clara didn't have a working cell signal on the property and didn't particularly want one, and I found her kneeling at the edge of what was unmistakably a pond. Not a mud puddle, a pond. It was maybe 20 feet across now, holding perhaps 2 feet of water, and the water was, I'm going to describe this as accurately as I can, alive. That's the only word. The edges had already begun to green. A narrow band of sedge grass had appeared along the eastern lip. I counted 4 dragonflies in the air above it. There was a small brown toad sitting on a mudflat on the north side that turned to look at me with the supreme indifference of an animal that has found exactly what it needs. "You came back," Clara said. She didn't look surprised. "I said 6 weeks," I said. "It's been 8. "I know." She was kneeling by the edge taking a water sample. Drawing it into a small glass vial, she stoppered with a rubber cap and labeled with a marker. She had a wooden tray beside her with 6 vials already labeled, and a notebook open to a page dense with numbers and observations in a handwriting so small I'd need reading glasses to parse it. "How many?" I asked. 43 complete," she said. 19 holding water, 6 showing vegetation already. I looked at the pond. I looked at the toad. I wrote in my logbook that evening, pond 7 or nearby, holding water, showing biological activity. Red Hawk seems unimpressed by this. I am not. She showed me the map that afternoon. We sat in her kitchen, which smelled of pine pitch and dried herbs and the ghost of something that had been cooking earlier, venison stew. She said, from a dough she'd taken in February and portioned carefully into a chest freezer. The kitchen table was entirely covered in paper. Large sheets of topographic data she'd printed at the library, annotated in pencil over weeks. Smaller pages of soil notes. Photographs she'd taken of each pond site before and after digging, arranged in chronological sequence. At the center was the map. It was hand-drawn, which I realize sounds primitive, but I want to be precise about what I mean. It was hand-drawn the way a surgeon's diagram is hand-drawn, with total intentionality, every mark chosen. She'd overlaid her own elevation readings onto a county survey base, then marked each of the 120 pond sites with a small circle and a code number. From each circle ran thin lines indicating the subsurface clay layers she'd identified, and connecting the pond sites to deeper features she'd mapped by inference and instrument. The likely path of the regional aquifer, the recharge zones where surface water could move downward through permeable substrates, the historical creek channels that hadn't carried water in decades, but whose gravel beds still existed underground like the memory of a river. It was the most coherent argument I had ever seen made in pencil. "Clara," I said, and then I didn't say anything else for a moment because I was doing what I do when something reorganizes my understanding of a situation, which is that I go quiet, and my right hand starts tapping the table in a pattern my wife calls my thinking tick. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. "You mapped the aquifer," I said. "Not the aquifer," she said. "The relationship between the surface and the aquifer, those are different things." She was right. They were different things. And in 24 years of county water management discussions, I had never seen anyone articulate that difference so clearly. She poured coffee. I looked at the map. Outside the window, the afternoon light hit the flat land and turned it briefly golden, the way it does out here when the angle is exactly right, when you catch the country being beautiful instead of just being itself. I thought about Pete Aldis laughing at the cattlemen's meeting. I thought about the man who'd said an Apache thing like it was a diagnosis. I thought about Clara digging in the dark with a locked-up shoulder, and I understood then, not completely, but in outline, what it costs to keep doing something when the people around you have decided it's a joke. I wrote in my logbook that evening the last entry for the season. She's not digging ponds. She's building a proof. The summer got dry, not catastrophically, that came later, but dry enough that conversations at the feed store shifted from prices to rain and back to rain. Wells that had been marginal for years dropped another inch, 2 inches. A stock tank on the Aldis property went to mud in late July, and Pete borrowed a water truck from his brother-in-law, and everyone agreed it was a hard summer and hoped for a wet fall. Clara's ponds held. Not all of them. 12 dried out completely by August. She'd noted which ones in her observation records, and would later identify that these were the sites where her clay layer readings had been weakest, where she'd been less certain about the subsurface conditions. The other 108 held varying levels of water, and the ones that had been active longest showed something she hadn't entirely predicted. The vegetation around their edges was stabilizing the soil, reducing the hard crust cracking that normally made water sheet off the alkaline flats instead of soaking in. The ponds were changing the surface conditions, which was reinforcing the percolation she'd intended. She was getting feedback, the land was talking back. She spent that August adjusting. She deepened 2 ponds that were losing water faster than expected. She added small earthen berms, 6 inches high, placed precisely, on the upslope sides of 7 ponds to redirect the microscopic topographic flows she'd been monitoring. She planted sedge plugs along the margins of the larger ponds, transplanting them from a creek drainage 10 miles east where they grew naturally. She did all of this alone. I stopped by twice in August, once she was out in the ponds, once she was in the well house standing at that pencil line wall. I saw her put the pencil to the wall and then lower it without marking. I asked her later what that had meant. "Still dropping," she said. "But slower." She said it the way a doctor says something to a patient, with the care of someone who understands the weight of the information and doesn't want it dropped carelessly. I wrote it down. I keep everything. By September, the ponds had been noticed. Not positively, not yet. A county road crew came to grade the access track on the Mendoza allotment boundary, and one of the workers, a young man from Juneau who had no particular stake in anything, posted a photo on social media of some kind of swamp thing someone built in the middle of the desert. It got 200 shares in a week. The comments were what you'd expect, half bewildered, half contemptuous, a few people who seemed to find the whole thing personally offensive. Someone shared it at the cattlemen's meeting. Pete Aldis said he'd been watching the mud puddles all summer, and they were doing all right for mud puddles, he supposed. This was actually the most generous assessment he'd given to date, and I wrote it down verbatim. Clara didn't have social media. Her daughter called from El Paso, said she'd seen it, asked if her mother was okay. Clara said she was fine and asked about the grandchildren and never mentioned the ponds again in that conversation. She told me about the call later, sitting on her porch in the early evening while the bats came out from under the eave of the well house. She had a colony of Mexican freetails, which she'd encouraged deliberately because they're extraordinarily effective at mosquito control, and she was very pleased with them. "My daughter worries," Clara said. "Mothers usually do," I said. "She thinks I'm lonely out here." I waited. "I'm not lonely," she said, in a way that didn't invite argument but also didn't close the door. She was watching the bats with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, not effort exactly, more like a settled willingness to see what was actually there. I drove home that evening thinking about the pencil lines on the wellhouse wall. 24 years of watching something decline. 24 years of keeping track of something no one else thought was worth tracking. I thought about what it means to know something is wrong before anyone else believes it. I thought about the specific loneliness of that, not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of being ahead of the evidence. I thought Clara Redhawk had been living in that particular loneliness for 2.5 decades. And I thought she'd built 120 ponds to find her way out of it. The drought arrived in February, the way serious droughts always arrive in this country, quietly, politely, the way a creditor comes to the door before they send the lawyers. I noticed it first not in any instrument reading or official measurement, but in the way the light changed. Out here, when the moisture goes out of the air completely, the sky takes on a particular quality of hardness, a blue so clean and unmediated that it stops looking like sky and starts looking like a wall. You can feel it on your skin, that light. It has edges. By March, the Seco Creek gauge, which had averaged about 2.3 feet of flow in wet season for the past decade, was reading 0.4. By April, it was reading 0. The commissioner's office sent out a water use advisory. The extension agent drove the county in his green truck making stops and leaving pamphlets. Pete Aldis, I heard secondhand, had started hauling water every 3 days, and the cost was eating into him in ways he wasn't admitting at the feed store, but that you could see in the way he held his coffee cup, too tight, like he was trying to keep something from spilling. I drove the county road in early April and turned down Clara's track without calling ahead, the same as always. She was in the ponds. Of course she was in the ponds. I want to describe what I saw with the precision it deserves, because I have thought about this moment many times since, and I want to get it right. The alkaline flats behind the Mendoza allotment, which I had driven past for years as a stretch of hard gray-white ground that cracked in summer and blew in wind and supported nothing voluntary except the occasional stunted greasewood, looked different. That's an inadequate word. Transformed is closer, but it implies drama that the scene didn't have. It was quieter than transformation, more patient. The 108 ponds that had survived the summer were smaller now, most of them, reduced by evaporation and dry months to perhaps half their August size. But they were still there. And around them, around a significant number of them, there was green. Not lush green, not the artificial green of irrigated land. A dry country green, soft and silverish, the color of things that have learned to hold moisture in their tissues against need. Clumps of sedge along the water margins. Thin stands of sacatin grass on the bermed upslopes. In 4 of the larger ponds, what looked like bulrush beginning to establish. Clara was walking between them with her notebook open, moving in a pattern I'd come to recognize as her observation route. She'd mapped it the first summer, numbered each pond, and moved through them in sequence, pausing at each one to record water level, margin vegetation state, soil moisture at 3 standard points she marked with painted stakes. She looked up when I stopped the truck. "Drought hit," I said, which was a useless thing to say, and she knew it. "Yes," she said. "Your ponds." She looked at them. 41 holding over 18 inches, 27 over 12, 32 between 6 and 12, 8 below 6. She paused. The aquifer recharge estimate should show by June. "How will you know?" She tilted her head toward the wellhouse, and I understood. The pencil lines. I started going to the commissioner's office in April. This wasn't at Clara's request. She hadn't asked me to do anything. But I'd been carrying her map in my head since that afternoon in her kitchen, and the drought had clarified something for me that had been forming slowly for months. What she was doing wasn't just one woman's project. It was a demonstration. It was evidence of something that the county had been failing to understand about its own water. I should explain my position. I've been county recorder for 11 years. Before that, I worked in water management for the state for 7 years, which is how I ended up here, a grant project that became a contract that became a life, the way things do when you're not paying attention. I know the county's water data reasonably well. I know where the gaps are. I know which wells are declining and at what rate, and which of those rates the commissioner's office has been pretending not to see. I went to the commissioner, and I told him there was a woman on the Alkaline Flats who had mapped the county aquifer recharge system in pencil over 2 years, using traditional knowledge and soil science, and her own water table records, and that her map might be the most accurate surface-to-aquifer relationship document the county possessed. The commissioner, whose name I'll keep to myself, because he's since done right by this and men deserve credit for improvement, listened to me with the expression of someone being told something they don't want to be responsible for knowing. "The woman with the mud ponds," he said. "Yes. Pete Aldous says." "Pete Aldous is hauling water 3 times a week, and his creek gauge is reading 0, I said. "I'm not sure Pete Aldous is the measurement I'd use right now." He was quiet. "I'd like to bring her in," I said, "formally to present the map." He said he'd think about it. I wrote in my logbook, "Commissioner will think about it," and then below that, he'll do it. He did it. Clara's reaction to the invitation was not what I'd expected. I drove out to tell her in person, because it felt like something that should be said face to face. She was in the well house when I arrived, door open, the afternoon light coming in at a low angle and catching the dust motes and the smell of old wood and damp stone that seems to exist independently of the actual moisture content of the ground. She was at the wall, not marking, just looking. I stood in the doorway and told her the commissioner's office wanted her to come in and present her water map and pond data to the board. She turned around. Her face did several things in a short time that I observed and didn't comment on because some moments deserve not to be narrated while they're happening. There was something that might have been relief, and then something much more complicated than relief, and then she put it away, not suppressed it, more like she folded it carefully and set it aside to examine later. "When?" she said. 3 weeks, May 12th. She nodded, then she looked back at the wall, at the pencil lines. 26 years, she said, mostly to herself. She'd have been pleased. I knew she meant her grandmother. I didn't ask. Some things are private not because they're shameful, but because their meaning lives in the specific silence between the people who share them. I drove home and wrote in my logbook. She said yes. She said it like she'd been waiting. The 3 weeks before the presentation were the busiest I'd seen Clara since I'd known her. She wasn't preparing a performance. That's important to understand. She wasn't learning how to make the information palatable to a skeptical audience. She was doing what she always did, refining her understanding of what she knew and making sure she could account for what she didn't. She had contacted the university hydrologist in March, a woman named Dr. Priya Naveen from the Tucson campus, who had come out to look at the ponds and spent 4 hours walking the site with Clara and periodically making sounds that I gathered were expressions of professional surprise. Dr. Naveen had run several soil permeability tests on site and pulled the county's aquifer data and run a comparison to Clara's predictive map. She called me after, unprompted. She'd found my name in the county records. "Are you the person who made this happen?" she asked. "I made a phone call," I said. "Her clay layer identification is remarkably accurate," she said. "She's using traditional land reading methods that aren't in the soil science literature because no one's thought to put them there. Her recharge zone mapping it's better than the county survey, is what I'm telling you. It accounts for variables that the county survey literally does not contain." I was quiet for a moment. "She's been watching this land for 24 years, I said. "That's evident," said Dr. Naveen. "It's also not sufficient to explain what she's done. She synthesized it. That's different from observation. That requires a particular kind of I don't know. Intelligence is the wrong word because it sounds like I'm surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm impressed." I thanked her and wrote the whole conversation down word for word. Pete Aldous came to see me in early May. He came to my office, which was unusual. We generally saw each other at meetings and at the feed store and occasionally at the diner, but he'd never come to the county building specifically to find me. He sat down across my desk and took his hat off and turned it in his hands in a circle, which was his nervous gesture, the same as my table tapping. "I heard about the meeting," he said. "News travels," I said. "What's she going to present?" "Her water map, her pond data. Dr. Naveen from Tucson is presenting supporting analysis." He turned the hat another full revolution. "She'd been talking to a hydrologist." "Since March," I said. "The hydrologist found her actually, not the other way around." Another revolution. "My south pond is down to nothing," he said. 16 inches of water in it last July. It's cracked mud now." I waited. "My well's dropped 6 inches since January," he said. I've never seen it drop that fast." "Clara's well dropped 1 inch," I said. "January to April this year." He stopped turning the hat. "I let that sit." "She's been tracking the water table since '98, I said. "On the wellhouse wall, in pencil, 1 mark per year." He looked at the floor. Then he looked at me. There was something in his face that I recognized as the particular discomfort of a man who has laughed at something that turned out to be true. It's different from ordinary embarrassment. It has a deeper register. It involves not just what you did, but who you were when you did it. "I should have listened," he said. "It wasn't quite enough. But it was something." "You can say that at the meeting," I said. He put his hat on and left. There's a moment in any long project, any sustained effort against resistance, when the person carrying it has to reckon privately with what it cost them before they can accept what it returned. I didn't see Clara do this, but I saw its aftermath. I stopped by on May 10th, 2 days before the meeting, ostensibly to confirm the time. She was on the porch. The bats were not yet out. It was late afternoon still, the light going amber. She had a cup of something in her hands, and she was looking at the flats, at the pond network visible as a scatter of darker shapes against the pale ground. She looked tired, not defeated. Tired the way people look when they've been holding something heavy for so long that even setting it down is exhausting, because your muscles have learned the weight of it and don't immediately know what to do with the absence. "You should sleep," I said. "I've been thinking about my grandmother," she said. "She had this piece of land before it was mine. Her mother had it before that. They all watched this water table. I'm not the first one to see it dropping." "No," I said. "They didn't have a county commission to bring a map to." I didn't say anything. "I keep thinking about what they would have done," she said. "With this meeting, with this opportunity." She looked at the ponds. "I think they would have said, don't mistake being heard for being believed. Don't mistake being invited for being welcomed." She wasn't saying this to be pessimistic. She was saying it the way you say true things when you want to carry them carefully. "They might be right," I said. "Yes," she said, "they might." She looked at the ponds for a long time. "I'm going anyway," she said. May 12th was a Tuesday. Clear morning, hard blue sky, the kind of light that has edges. I arrived at the commissioner's building at 8 a.m. to help Clara set up. She was already there. She'd brought the map in a cardboard tube and unrolled it carefully on the table in the meeting room, weighting the corners with 4 smooth creek stones she'd brought from her property. The stones were gray and rounded, and they sat on the county's laminate conference table like 4 small assertions about what the land actually looked like. Dr. Naveen had driven up from Tucson and sat quietly in the corner reviewing her notes. She was a small woman with quick eyes and a habit of pushing her glasses up with one finger when she was thinking, which she did 17 times during the presentation. The commissioners arrived, the county extension agent, Pete Aldis, and 3 other ranchers who'd asked to observe. Clara stood at the map, and she talked for 47 minutes. I've attended hundreds of presentations in this room. Budget hearings, water use disputes, grazing allotment challenges. I've seen engineers with expensive consultants and attorneys with stacked binders and academics with projected slideshows, and none of them have held that room the way Clara Redhawk held it that morning, standing next to her hand-drawn map with 4 creek stones for paperweights. She didn't perform authority. She had it, which is different. She spoke in the measured, specific way of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 26 years, not rehearsing the speech, but accumulating the knowledge that made the speech unnecessary. She showed the aquifer recharge zones. She showed the pond placement rationale. She showed the water table data from her wellhouse wall, which she'd photographed and included in a supplemental document. She showed the comparison to the county's official survey. The official survey had been done in 2009. It was 17 years old, and it had not been updated despite documented aquifer changes, because updating it cost money that had been deprioritized 6 times in 6 budget cycles. Her map covered everything the official survey covered, and added 17 years of ground truth observation. She showed them the aquifer recharge zones. Page 4. She turned to the commissioners and said, without raising her voice, "Page 4, the aquifer recharge zones, you'll find they match exactly." The room was quiet. That was the silence I told you about at the beginning, the particular silence that falls when someone who was laughed at walks back and holding the proof. Nobody laughed that morning. After a silence like that, you'd expect something dramatic to happen. A vote, a resolution, a formal acknowledgement with handshakes, and maybe a photographer from the county paper. That's how these stories get told when other people tell them, with a clean moment of vindication followed by a clean resolution. What actually happened was that Commissioner Dale Whitmore said he wanted to table the presentation for further review, and 2 of the 3 other commissioners nodded, and Clara Redhawk picked up her 4 creek stones, placed them in her shirt pocket, and rolled her map back into its cardboard tube without changing her expression. I wrote in my logbook that evening, tabled, they tabled it. Below that I wrote, she knew they would. I drove out the following Sunday because I couldn't not. Clara was in the ponds. It was mid-May, and the drought had not relented. The county rainfall gauge for the past 90 days read 0.6 inches. The state had issued a Level 2 drought classification for Crockett County, which meant that certain groundwater restrictions were now technically in effect, which meant almost nothing in practical terms because no one had the staff to enforce them. Her ponds, the 108 that had survived, were doing something extraordinary. I know that word, I know it implies magnitude, but I want to be precise. Extraordinary in this case means simply beyond what should have been there, beyond what any explanation except her own would have predicted. In the middle of a Level 2 drought, with county stock tanks cracked and wells dropping and the Seco Creek gauge at 0, Clara Redhawk's 108 ponds were holding water. Not much water, not the levels of June, but measurable, real, present water, the kind that dragonflies find and that toads return to, and that the air near it smells different because moisture has memory even in hard country. She was at pond 43, taking her readings, when I found her. She had knee-high rubber boots on over her canvas pants, and her left boot had developed a slow leak that left a small wet print with every step. She hadn't fixed it because, she told me when I pointed it out, she hadn't noticed it until I said something. "How's the table?" I asked, the wellhouse I meant, the pencil lines. She was quiet for a moment, and I thought she wasn't going to answer, or that the answer was bad. "Same," she said, "holding." 1-inch drop January to May, same as the year before, not recovering, but not accelerating either. The ponds are helping, I said. Something is, she said. Can't be entirely certain what. I found this interesting. After everything, after 26 years of watching and mapping and building and being mocked and standing in front of the commissioners and being tabled, she still wouldn't overclaim. She still held the line between what she knew and what she thought. I've met a lot of certain people in my life. They exhaust me. Clara's uncertainty felt like a different quality entirely, not doubt, but precision. The willingness to say, I don't know exactly without it meaning, I don't know anything. The county moved faster than I expected, and slower than it should have. Commissioner Whitmore called me in June and told me the board had reviewed Dr. Navin's analysis and was interested in pursuing a conversation about the water map. He used the phrase conversation 3 times in that phone call, which I noted because it is the official word for we're not ready to act, but we need to look like we might be. I called Dr. Navin, who was not surprised. This is how it goes, she said. The conversation phase can last 1 year or 7, depends on how bad the drought gets. The aquifer is at 1998 recharge levels, I said, according to Clara's data. I know, she said. Send them that in writing. Don't editorialize, just the number. I sent it in writing. The number was stark enough on its own. Pete Aldous came to see me again in July. He looked worse than he had in May. He'd lost 15 head of cattle to the heat, not to thirst, technically, but to the compounding stress of dry conditions on animals that were already pushing their physical margins. He'd borrowed money from his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law was beginning to ask questions about the timeline for repayment. He sat across my desk and didn't turn his hat this time. He set it flat on the desk and pressed his palms down on it like he was preventing it from blowing away, which it couldn't because we were inside. I want to help her, he said. I waited. The ponds, he said. I want to dig on my section. She said she identified potential recharge zones on my side of the fence, too. I want to do what she did. You should tell her that, I said. I did. That surprised me when, last week, drove out. Told her I was sorry I didn't listen in February, that I should have helped when she asked, that I'd like to help now if she'd have me. What did she say? He picked up his hat. She said she'd think about it. He turned the hat once. That was 5 days ago. I haven't heard. I didn't say anything. She has every right to tell me to go to hell, he said. Yes, I said, she does. She didn't. I found out later that she'd called him the next day and asked if he still had the Kubota, and he said yes. And she asked if his shoulder worked, meaning her own shoulder, which still had the old tear, and he said yes, he had 2 working shoulders, and she said she'd be over Monday morning. They dug 6 ponds together on his section through July. He brought lunch. She brought the maps. I heard about this from Pete, not from Clara, because Clara told me when I asked her about it. It's not a story about me and Pete. It's a story about the water. That's the truest thing I know about her. The drought broke in August, briefly, with a monsoon system that came up from the Gulf and dropped 4 inches in 3 days. 4 inches in 3 days, in alkaline hardpan, normally means flooding. It means water sheeting off the cracked surface faster than the ground can accept it, running to channel, carrying topsoil, gone within hours. I drove the county road the morning after the storm, the way I always do after significant rain, because I've been recording weather events for 11 years, and I believe in first-hand observation over any gauge. I turned down Clara's track. The surrounding flats, the Mendoza allotment, the sections north and east, were showing the usual post-monsoon surface flooding. Long, shallow sheets of moving water, gray-brown, loaded with sediment, already finding the low channels and moving toward them. The road crew would have some work to do on the approaches. This was normal. This was what always happened. On Clara's section, something different was happening. The monsoon water, instead of sheeting uniformly, was moving, not randomly, with direction, pulled toward the pond sites. The small earthen berms she'd placed on the upslope sides were catching the runoff and directing it inward. The ponds, already holding their drought-reduced levels, were filling. The ones with established vegetation margins were holding their banks. The sedge and saccatine grass was doing what established vegetation does, absorbing the energy of running water, slowing it, encouraging it downward. 3 of the ponds were at capacity. I could see the spillways she'd designed, small notched channels on the downslope sides that directed overflow to the next pond in sequence. It was a system, that's what it was. Not 120 holes in the ground, a system. I stood at the edge of the track watching water move through it for probably 20 minutes. The air smelled of wet caliche and the specific mineral sharpness of clay soil after rain. Above me, a zone-tailed hawk was riding the updraft from the warming ground. I wrote in my logbook, storm system 4.1 inches in 72 hours. Red Hawk Pond system functioning as designed. Adjacent sections, standard sheet flooding, sediment loss. Red Hawk section, directed percolation, negligible sediment movement. And then I wrote, she built this. She actually built this. Clara called me in September. This was unusual. She almost never called me. Our exchanges being conducted in person or occasionally through notes left in my truck when she knew I'd be driving the county road. The table dropped, she said. My chest tightened. How much? 1/2 inch since January total. I sat with that for a moment. I started. Last year it dropped 1 inch. The year before 1.5 inches. The year before that 2 inches. Pause. This was the driest spring in 11 years. And the table dropped 1/2 inch, I said. Yes. I heard something in her voice. Not triumph. Not the sound of a person who has won an argument. Something older and quieter than that. The sound of a person who has been right about something painful for a long time, and is now watching the first evidence emerge into the world where other people can see it. Clara, I said. It might be a 1-year anomaly, she said immediately. I need 3 years of data to draw any conclusion. Clara. She was quiet. Your grandmother would be pleased, I said. A longer quiet. Then, yes, she said, I think she would. The commissioner's office called me in late September with news I'd been expecting but not timing. They were formally adopting Clara's water map as the county's baseline aquifer relationship document. They were commissioning Dr. Navin's university department to expand it using modern instrument surveys built on Clara's methodology. They were allocating budget to implement a county-wide surface water retention program modeled on her pond network design. They were naming the methodology document, formally, in county records, the Red Hawk Water Conservation Framework. I drove out to tell her in person. She was in the well house. The door was open. The late September light was low and gold, and it came through the door at an angle that hit the pencil lines on the interior wall and threw each one into sharp relief. 26 lines, different heights, 26 years of watching, all of them below where they'd started, and the most recent one the smallest drop of all. They adopted the map, I said. The county, it's official. They're naming the methodology the Red Hawk Framework. She looked at the wall. She put her finger on the most recent mark, the line she'd drawn in January, the one closest to where she hoped it would someday turn around. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she took the pencil from its nail on the wall. It was always kept there on a specific nail, and she made a small mark that wasn't the annual water reading. She made it on the wood beside the most recent line, not on the measurement itself, but adjacent to it. A small, specific mark that I couldn't identify from where I stood. I didn't ask. Some things are private not because they're shameful, but because their meaning lives in the specific silence between the people who share them. I drove home. The light was doing the thing it does here in September evenings, turning the flats amber, making the ordinary landscape briefly ache with something that isn't quite beauty and isn't quite sorrow, but lives right between them. I wrote in my logbook last entry for that volume, map adopted, framework named, 26 years of watching a water table, 1/2 inch this year, 1/2 inch. And then I started a new volume. I went to the commissioners' meeting in December when the formal vote on the framework implementation budget was held. Clara was there, sitting in the back row, still in her canvas work pants, the raven feather hat on her knee. Commissioner Whitmore made a speech. It was, as political speeches go, adequate. He credited the county's leadership. He credited Dr. Navin's university partnership. He credited the community's resilience. He credited Clara in one sentence as a long-time local observer whose data contributed significantly to the new framework. I looked at Clara. She was watching him with an expression I recognized, the mild interest of someone who has heard a variation of this before. She was turning one of her creek stones in her hand, the smooth gray ones she'd brought to the meeting as table weights. Turning it the way Pete turned his hat, the way I tapped the table. When it was over, she stood up, put the stone in her pocket, and walked out before the reception coffee was poured. I caught up with her in the parking lot. "Long-time local observer," I said. "It's accurate," she said. "I have been observing locally for a long time." There was no bitterness in it. There wasn't even irony, or if there was, it was the kind of irony that has been converted into something else through years of patient labor. Something tougher and more useful. She put on her hat. The raven feather moved in the December wind. "I have to check the ponds tomorrow," she said. "There's a cold front coming. I want to see how the margins hold." I watched her walk to the rust-orange Dodge. She climbed in. The engine turned over twice, 3 times caught. I thought about the pencil lines. I thought about what she'd marked next to the most recent one, that small additional mark I hadn't been able to see from the doorway. I'd thought about it for 3 months, and I still didn't know what it was. I thought about her grandmother pressing a raven feather into a straw hat and what she'd said when she did it, and that I'd never know that either, and that this was right and correct. That some things belong entirely to the people who carry them. The truck's taillights turned red at the parking lot exit. Then she was gone into the December dark. The wind moved through the lot, and I stood in it for a minute, hands in my pockets, and I thought about the water table. 1/2 inch this year, in the driest spring in 11 years, in the middle of a drought that had cracked Pete Aldis's stock tanks and zeroed the Seco Creek gauge and driven the county to finally look at what had been right there in pencil on a wellhouse wall for 26 years.